Next on our schedule is a discussion, and this is going to be led by our Assistant Director of the Science and Engineering Library at Stanford, Ashley Jester, and I will allow Ashley to come in with her guests and get seated and set up. I wanted to say that one reason that we made a point, at least certainly at Stanford, but also for this conference, of using this ambiguous term, artificial intelligence, was precisely to take advantage of that ambiguity and to make sure that we really were not just talking about technology and the specific implications of technology, but actually think more about the implications of artificial intelligence that are social, political, cultural. And so part of that is having these discussion sessions that are focused not so much explicitly on the technology, but how does that technology impact us? And so I give you Ashley Jester, AI and Data Privacy. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I have a wonderful panel of distinguished guests joining me. Monica Lam, who is a professor here at Stanford of computer science, Angèle Christin, who is also a professor here at Stanford in sociology, and Rachael Thomas, who is a data scientist and the founder of Fast AI and also runs the Center for Data Science and Ethics, or I'm getting the name wrong at US.
Center for Applied Data Ethics.
Thank you, Center for Applied Data Ethics at the University of San Francisco. Thank you, Rachel. And I wanted to just kind of jump in. I think that the talk that Brian gave really set us up for a lot of the questions that we wanted to explore here. And I think fundamentally, maybe to start with, when data is so fundamental to the algorithm, what do we think about, or what are the implications of privacy around using data in algorithms that we know comes from human beings? And I think that one thing that hasn't been talked about a lot today, we've talked about data, but we've never talked about what the data is about. And the data is about stuff. And some of that stuff is inanimate objects about the world, but some of that stuff is human beings and other things that we feel more ethical obligations toward. And so just kind of starting from that point, what is the inherent privacy kind of complication when you're talking about using a data set in AI?
Well, I'm Monica Lam. I'm a professor in the computer science department. It's been for 30 years. And I started out as a regular computer scientist working on performance, building high-performance computers. But in the last 10 years, I've been very concerned about what's going on with privacy. And I cannot believe that we can have a single company own about 2 billion people's worth of private data. And so I've been working on this problem for a while. It is a really tough problem. And what we saw here is that the problem is going to get worse and not better if we just keep going. And the threat that is coming, that we are seeing in the future, is the virtual assistant. Okay, if you think about Alexa, Google Assistant, they're at your home, they are listening in on the conversations, and they have been extremely well adopted. They reached about 50 million Americans in 2 years, which is faster than what happened in the internet. And the question really is that what is going to happen when you have a virtual assistant that knows everything about you because they give you a linguistic interface, and you are now using that to interface with your IoTs, your Facebook account, your Amazon account, your Google account, and then it gets into health, education, and so forth. And the reason is that it's very compelling because we really don't need to have a GUI interface when I have AI that allows us to talk to the computer like we are talking to each other in natural language. So you can imagine that there will be a single or couple of organizations that hear all the conversations. And if you consider like the second most popular virtual assistant is Baidu, okay? And that's in China, and that means that the government is also listening in at the same time. And I think that there's this issue that AI is collecting a lot of private data is already here because people are bugging their own houses, even though the AI is still not that great because we all have tried to use those systems. Anyways, so what we have been doing is to say, we cannot tell people not to use that technology. As technologists, what we want to do is to give people the better technology. We have the power to talk to the assistant. We get to use the virtual assistants, and in the meantime, also protect privacy. So our research group is that we are building an assistant that can sit in your own house. All the data that you are interfacing with, from the IoTs to all the web accounts and so forth, can be stored just in your own home, or you can park it with anybody else. But the most important thing is that we have to have choice about where you park the data. Then people can compete, and you can have a chance of privacy. We have a fully working prototype, and one more point that I want to bring up is that this is an intellectually very challenging problem. So that's good news, because it means that the academia could potentially get together and build something that is better than what is offered by the industry, and keep it open. Of course, the industry will jump in as well. We're just saying that we can participate, and having an open system can potentially change the game here, so that everybody can get the convenience that is offered by AI and also own their data. So that's what we've been up to.
Great.
Angela, why don't you talk about your research a bit?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. So as Ashley mentioned, I was trained as a sociologist, and I'm really interested in providing a kind of sociological, social scientific approach to artificial intelligence. And the way I do that is by focusing not so much on how the models are built, which is really important, but more on how they're deployed. So I'm an ethnographer, which means that I do observations and interviews, mostly in workplaces. And I look at how workers make sense of algorithmic systems and AI, and about the data that's being collected about them. I've been doing that in several settings, including web newsrooms, where there is a massive amount of data being collected, not only about readers, but also about how productive and popular journalistic production is, and also in criminal courts. So looking at the uses of risk assessment tools, which are predictive algorithms that assess the risk of recidivism of defendants, that have been extremely criticized over the past 2 years for the kind of biases and reproduction of inequalities that they may come with. And I take a bit of a different approach, and I kind of spend a lot of time in criminal courts talking with judges, prosecutors, lawyers, defense attorneys, defendants, like everybody who kind of works and kind of goes through the criminal justice system, to see how they make sense of these systems and these risk scores, and how much they know about what's going on. And I think that here, perhaps the one kind of intervention that I would like to make with respect to the debate about privacy is that what I see as an ethnographer in many of the organizations I study is that data that's originally collected for one goal ends up being used for another goal. And that's like a traditional kind of mission creep process that we all see probably in our work, like, right? Mm-hmm. But I find that fascinating, because basically you have lots of systems, like what was presented before our panel, that are collected, say, with the goal of trying to make decision-making more objective, more fair, more efficient, less subjective, like whatever. Like you just pick whatever you want to do. But then what happens along the way when these systems are being implemented within organizations is that usually you end up having more worker surveillance, right? And managers end up using the systems to collect data about their workers, collect data about their customers, and then trying to control the workforce much more than what was the case before. And so I think that, that this question of mission creep is really important when we think about privacy and surveillance, but also it raises a question about how much agency do people really have in deciding about privacy, right? Like, we like to think about privacy as this, like, oh, it's my choice, my individual choice, and I can just decide, like, about the trade-offs that I'm willing to make. But in most cases, we don't really have a choice, and workers don't really have a choice, and even as customers, we don't really have a choice. And so that, in turn, raises, I think, broader kind of sociological questions about what's the kind of structural changes that would need to happen to kind of address questions about privacy and surveillance.
Thank you. I'm Rachael Thomas, and I'm co-founder of FastAI and director of the Center for Applied Data Ethics at USF. And so my interest for the past few years has been getting a kind of broader and more diverse group of people into AI. And for me, that is kind of very much linked with, I think, one of the ways towards kind of addressing many of the ethical concerns that we're seeing. I think many of the kind of misuses and kind of unethical applications are arising out of the fact that we've had a very homogeneous group kind of in this one specific geographic location that is not very racially diverse or gender diverse, creating technology that's being used all over the world. And so these are kind of very much related for me. With the Center for Applied Data Ethics, we're really trying to focus on kind of harms that are already happening now. And I see a few big categories for that being algorithmic bias, disinformation, and surveillance. And I think these questions of data privacy intersect with all three of those. So I really agree with this previous point about it's too often it's framed as kind of individuals can opt in or opt out, but often there's not meaningful consent, what I would consider truly meaningful consent around using how data is being used or collected. And I think also we need to start thinking of data privacy more as a public good, and so something that individual decisions are not going to be sufficient to govern. And just to give, I guess, two examples of risk. One is, there are a lot of concerns about the risk of surveillance with facial recognition. In 2015, Baltimore police used facial recognition to identify protesters protesting the death of Freddie Gray. And I think that is very concerning and will have a very chilling impact on civil rights if that sort of use expands or continues. Another thing I think to think about is just with all the data being collected, the underlying motivation for many of the large companies is around the personalized ad targeting. And I don't think that all advertising is wrong, but we need to remember that advertising, in a sense, is about manipulation and trying to get someone to do something. And I think that becomes concerning when it has so much personalized data about somebody, and when it's being used for these purposes such as political influence, or even kind of seeing who might be susceptible to believing various conspiracy theories, such as white supremacist conspiracy theories. So it raises a lot of concerns.
And I think that the three of you all touched on the idea of consent and how this is coming into our lives in a way that we might not be able to have a role in stopping.
Yeah, there's the article that I read by Tim Wu from Columbia University, and the title, I just really loved the phrase he coined, and that was the tyranny of convenience. Okay, so what he pointed out is that people want convenience, and this is, you cannot, so it turns out that in his article, he was saying that we should just not want to have the convenience. But as a technologist, we have to say, no, you don't. You want to provide the convenience, but also protect privacy. The point that you brought up, which is we don't really have choice. Because if you just think about sharing, it's like if I don't use Facebook, where am I going to, what am I going to do? How am I going to be able to share data with others? And this is and I believe that it is because for the last 10, 15 years, there is not enough emphasis on technology for social good, okay? So we know how to distribute data. So if you think about email, all right, you have a choice about where you park your email. Hillary Clinton even ran her own email servers in her own house, okay? So if we give people the technology so that they can share easily, then they will have a real choice. They don't really have a choice. But if we give people this technology, then people can, in fact, have a choice, and they say, I want advertising with free email, or I will pay $5, and I will not have my email read and not get advertised. So I believe that one of the things that has been missing is investment in technology for social good.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I mean, so I have three thoughts that I'm going to walk through very quickly. The first one is that there is so we all agree that so it's called click wrap, right? So terms of use and consent and how you just kind of click yes, like please, like I do not want to read the kind of legal lingo, like this is like incomprehensible for most people. So just like, sure, I consent to anything, right? And so I think that kind of raises the question of like, yeah, what is meaningful consent? What would be the procedures that we should put in place to have meaningful consent? And is meaningful consent even meaningful in a context where like our data is precious, and here drawing on Shoshana Zuboff's idea of surveillance capitalism, it's just like our behavioral data is what sustains the digital ecosystems. That's how people make money and companies make money, and that's how, to some extent, we get all of these glossy campuses all across Silicon Valley, right? And so opting out of that system is kind of complicated. The second thing is that, of course, like the idea of like paying for subscription or paying for like services that would provide like extra privacy is tempting. I am a bit concerned as a sociologist about the ramifications in terms of inequality, right? Would that mean that we would have a two-tiered system where rich people would have more privacy than poor people? And how is privacy distributed, right? And that leads me to my third kind of case, which is not so much like a point, but just a question that was, a topic that was brought up by the previous speaker, and which I just find so interesting because it kind of gives a sense of the complexities of the problem, and that's facial recognition. So as he mentioned, there has been a debate about the fact that the data sets used to build facial recognition software programs are overwhelmingly white and male, and for that reason, the programs perform much more poorly on women and women of color, right? Okay, so we're like, oh, bias, not good. We want to fix this, right? But do we? Because these visual recognition programs are used for policing, and they're used mostly to police people of color. Do we want them to be more accurate? I mean, is it something that as a collective, we really feel like they should really recognize women and people of color kind of much more efficiently than they're actually doing right now? And I'm not saying that I have a clear answer to this question, right? I think it's a really complex question. It depends on like where the tools are implemented, how they're implemented, what are we deploying them for? But I do think that fixing bias is not necessarily the golden solution. Perhaps we need to think a bit more carefully about the next steps and the deployment of all of these tools in the wild.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. We really, I think, need to be thinking about, are there certain uses that we want to decide are not okay, certain types of data that we think shouldn't be collected or shouldn't be used for certain purposes. And as mentioned before, there is often the scope creep of data collected for one purpose ends up being used for others. One example I'm thinking of is I think both Facebook and Twitter collected phone numbers that they said would just be used for two-factor authentication, which is a security technique, and then used them for advertising and shared them with advertisers. And kind of going along with these issues of our typical notions of consent, it's typically in this kind of all or nothing, like you have to agree to these pages and pages of whatever the company says, or nothing, you can't use the service at all, and that doesn't give us any sort of granular ability to opt into certain uses but not others. I'll say another issue I think around this idea of individual data consent is that even if an individual opts out, if enough people are giving their data, we can make inferences about that individual, which is kind of the point of machine learning. And so again, I think we're going to need something broader to safeguard notions of data privacy that we do want to protect on a societal level, because an individual opting out won't necessarily be enough to protect them if we can make inferences about them.
I want to respond to what you mentioned about would it get to a point where the rich people have privacy and the poor people don't? And I think that if you think about telephone lines, right? We're saying that there are poor people who cannot afford it, and we actually make it possible for them to be able to have telephone service. So at some point, you really think about the ability to interact on the digital internet is a basic right and basic need that people should have. And maybe we should think about the public infrastructure as providing that level of support, right? I mean, if you think about telcos, I mean, they're very regulated. They don't just arbitrarily take your telephone conversations and turn it into what they make money on. So why are we not? What I think is happening is that in the last 20 years, we haven't really updated our concept of public infrastructures. Okay, we really have to be able to share, and this should be regulated. And technology, we spend a lot. Right now, the companies are spending a lot of time productizing what makes money, but we really need to prioritize what makes the society be respectful of people's privacy. And I think that that's something we have to change. And another point is about the consent. And I think what is going to happen is that if you imagine the future where you have a digital agent like a virtual assistant, they know about all your data. If you have this agent work on your behalf, this agent will be able to understand what are all the questions being asked and release different kinds of information to different vendors based on based on what you want. And it is very sophisticated. It's really complex. It's like you might want to say, look, I will share my information about where I catch my flu with the CDC and so forth, but not where I am all the time and so forth. So this is the kind of thing that actually we believe that virtual assistants will be able to help you with. And we're now talking about the next, I would say, 5 years. It is not like far out in the future. But I think that, I understand that technology has caused a lot of issues, but it is also very, very useful if we put that to use in the right way.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I like that point about thinking about public infrastructure. And so kind of an example of the opposite, I think as Facebook's Free Basics. This is the program that was previously called internet.org, but they are in 50 poor countries, and they offer people, quote, free internet, but it's a walled garden access through Facebook that only lets people access certain websites. US corporations are disproportionately represented in that group of websites. And so this is something, that was kind of advertised as, we're making the internet available for poor people, but in a way that involved a real kind of conflict of interest and imposing, I think, a kind of outside set of values on many communities. And I think that's very different than the system that would have been come up with kind of under a more public infrastructure framing.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of go on a bit with that, I think that the difference between shall we say, consumer type model where we can easily opt in and opt out, and the kind of public infrastructure model, it's very much a continuum, right? And so I love this, so unfortunately I don't remember her name right now, but a journalist at Gizmodo did this experiment where she tried to cut the big five from her life. Do you remember?
Kashmir Hill.
Yeah, Kashmir Hill. She's amazing. She's a great tech journalist. Just follow her on Twitter or wherever. She's just doing fantastic work. And so she tried to cut the big kind of five from her life, right? And so stopping using Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and I'm forgetting the last one, Microsoft. And basically, and so she did it one brand at a time, right? So first she tried to cut Facebook, then Google. She did Facebook and Google, and then Facebook, Google, and Apple. And basically, by the end, she was like, this is impossible. It is impossible. I cannot do my job. And actually, what was very striking and interesting for me was that can you guess which one was the hardest to cut?
Google.
Amazon?
Actually, Amazon. And because that's because of the Amazon cloud services, right? And the fact that basically so many websites and platforms now store their data on the Amazon cloud, and therefore And so she was just, by the end, she was like, I give up. That's just not doable. And so I think that kind of raises questions about, how much is this an opt-in, opt-out model versus just modern life is impossible without all of these services. And so that in turn raises the questions of what's the responsibilities of big tech and platforms to embrace this public role. And there is a lot of scholarship in science and technology studies showing that platforms have been extremely reluctant to see themselves as public providers, and for a lot of reasons, which make a ton of sense, but that perhaps time has come to kind of start thinking about the big five as having a public role, and ones that should be further regulated, and ones that should have a more, shall we say, thoughtful way of thinking about individual data.
I'm surprised that you put the Amazon cloud in that category, because it is can you imagine without Amazon cloud, you won't have a lot of small vendors, because there is just no way for anybody to host a data center. So I would like to separate that out, and then, because I actually think that there should be more of such infrastructures and tools and so forth, so that you can have a lot of companies competing. But I hear you about what happens with, how do you cut all the top 5 out of your if you consider Amazon as the shopping piece, now maybe you can cut that out.
I think that's part of the concern, is that so many services are bundled together.
That is all kind of,
well, they have a business relationship that is very, very different. If I am hosting your data and I started taking your data and selling it, that's a no-no in their business terms. So that's why I want to separate the cloud.
There's some separation, but it's a lot of power for the corporation of Amazon to kind of have.
Well, there are 3 cloud providers. That's the good news, because there is the Microsoft and then Google and Amazon. So there is at least a little bit of a choice, and they are competing. And that's part of the reason why that works out, I think, better than most of other things, because they are just trying to get enough business, and so the cost is reasonable and so forth. But in the meantime, I want to bring up the fact that out of this 5, at least Apple is saying that they care about security and privacy. And I am really hoping, actually, in our work, that Apple could be a partner in endorsing this open, for example, open virtual assistant platform, so that we are not, so that there's a huge difference between what Apple does and what the other companies do, because Apple actually makes money out of hardware, whereas the other companies really need the user data for their businesses. So I hope that there are more companies like that.
I mean, I agree with that, but I would draw the distinction with Google and Facebook in terms of having the advertising as their fundamental business model as being the kind of category that's slightly different from Microsoft, Amazon, and Apple to some extent are like selling products in a different way that's kind of not as advertising driven.
I was going to say, as a political scientist, I'm struck by all of you talking about public goods and bringing up public goods, which is, of course, what we love to study. And when we think about public goods, and I even see it emerging here, you're talking about mobilizing some latent interest that we know kind of exists out there for everyone in privacy, but doesn't overcome their individual desire to have the convenience of holding back. And so they're going to give up their data, but in the abstract, they believe in the idea of privacy. How do we frame this for the public in a way to help drive that conversation forward to generate the kind of public infrastructure you all are discussing?
That's what I want to know.
That's a hard question.
Well, let's do it this way. The reason why I started thinking about this is because I held the first open virtual assistant workshop about a month ago, and we invited all kinds of different people, and what it was represented were a few nonprofits, and they brought all the top 5s were there. All right, all the companies that you are making virtual assistants are there, and then there are many more companies from telcos to retailers to like banks and so forth. They're all there. The reason is that they don't want to have a single company that owns all the user data anyway. And if you think about what the virtual assistants do, not only do they take user data, they are also a gateway to the internet. Because you're going to go through them to reach the banks and so forth. It's like the new browser. Okay? The browser is a way to get to the graphical user interface. But the virtual assistant is the interface to the linguistic web. All right? And that's being made proprietary because Amazon has 100,000 skills. That means that 100,000 different companies are being accessed through the virtual assistant. So what I'm hoping is that you are bringing in other large companies who do not like to see this whole encapsulation of all users' data by a single company. And they may be able to put it up enough resources and interest to keep this open, to give people the ability to have a choice about where they park their data. Because otherwise, Amazon or Google will be your bank and your insurance company, your credit card company, and what have you, because they have too much personal data. So that's the second. So I think it is important to bring other enterprises in on this picture, because Amazon they have 100,000 skills and they have 10,000 employees just on Alexa. Okay, and this is the price that I don't think that other than Google and Amazon, any other of the companies can invest in the same way, and they are trying to capture the entire internet by voice, the linguistic version of it. So what I'm saying here is that we would like to bring other enterprises to keep the internet open, to give people choice. And then there is also the nonprofits. The nonprofits can include the government, for example, right now, if I look at my research, we have a technology, but I just don't have the engineering power. I don't need the 10,000 employees, but I do need my 50 engineers, okay? And there is no money that we can get. There is no source of money that provides that level of engineering to provide software for the common good so far, and we're looking for that. And then maybe we can turn to the foundations. Actually, one of the Sloan Foundation was represented there, and actually Doran Weber is the person who got me thinking that maybe there is another source of funding that can help build technology for the society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just gathering my thoughts, I have lots of thoughts, but basically, okay, so the way I think about it is this is a bit like the Industrial Revolution. It's like a ton of stuff is changing and it's affecting every single domain, right? So we can't really focus on only technology or only AI. It's just taking place across sectors. And the dynamics of every single sector are different, right? You can't talk about policing in the same way that you talk about media. The dynamics of both algorithmic systems and privacy and bias are going to look very different to some extent across all of these areas. So the way I think about it, one way in which we can really make progress is okay, so I know that librarians really don't like the word literacy. Do people agree with that? Or actually, do you like the word literacy? Anyway, so increase, we have a love-hate relationship. Yeah, I mean, it's me too, to be honest. But anyway, but I think that improving algorithmic literacy, for lack of a better word, but just creating new forums for public debate around the kind of pros and cons of many of these technologies is one way to go. So let me give a couple of examples about what I mean. So the first one is that I think that right now, for example, the media coverage of artificial intelligence has really changed over the past 3 years, right? 3 years ago, it was whoa, amazing, great, we're going to be working with robots and Facebook is saving the world, one post at a time, this is so cool. And now it's bias everywhere, it's really awful, etc. But that's interesting in itself, in the sense that I think that Silicon Valley is going through a moment of reckoning, which is perhaps going a bit too far in the other direction. But somewhere in between these two things, there is an impetus for meaningful change. I'm also incredibly admirative of the work of, I'm mentioning tech journalists whom I think are doing amazing work right now in covering technology companies not only as business topics, right? And just not reporting the quarterly kind of things that tech companies go with, or the kind of IPOs that they're going through, but also kind of really trying to get to the actual impact that many of these technologies have on the social world. I'm also really impressed by the work that nonprofits are doing, and especially I'm thinking of critical nonprofits that are trying to bring together technologists, academics, journalists, and public administrations. I'm thinking here about Data and Society, for example, in New York, which is led by Dana Boyd, or AI Now, also in New York by Kate Crawford, and your center. I think that all of these places are trying to bring together people who have very different incentives, very different views of the world, and trying to develop a shared language to talk about these questions, right? And to some extent, I think this panel is doing the same thing. That's exactly the kind of discussions that should happen. And the third thought, and then I'll stop, is that I think that a lot is taking place at the local level right now, which I find really interesting. And I'm thinking in particular about facial recognition and predictive policing, which where there has been a lot of movement at the city level. With specific cities, including San Francisco, actually, and a couple of others, banning the use of specific either recognition softwares or predictive softwares, saying, like, we are not ready. So we're going to stop and think about this for a while. And I think that all of this was due to some extent to collective movements, activism, and a kind of vibrant type of public sphere where people from different sides of the spectrum kind of came together being like, hey, this technology raises a lot of concern. Can we just think about this carefully together? And I think that things are really changing. So I'm optimistic.
Cool, you took two of my points.
Very cool, sorry.
Yeah, so I would just echo this idea of needing to think about the specific domains, such as policing, and that's an area where we have seen these really effective and successful local movements, getting facial recognition banned in several cities. Another example would be the group of tenants in New York whose landlord was going to put in a ton of cameras for facial recognition, and they successfully organized around that, kind of pushing back. Anil Dash has a great article saying there is no tech industry anymore because tech is being used in every industry, and so the term is kind of too broad to even be meaningful, and that we really need to think about kind of the domain-specific problems that arise.
Oh, I should also mention that, of course, GDPR has been a really important first step towards making the data at least not trapped in the different by the different companies. And I think that that's a good sign that the government is paying attention to that. And of course, there is a Californian version of that as well. And I think that there is this next step of kind of, once you release this information, there has to be a way for you to take this information and make it convenient for you as well. And that's where the cooperation of the government and tech people can come in and do something about it. And I think that that's the two parties can play a role if they work together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Monica, I was really struck by the answer that you came up with, which was we need to engage other enterprises and other entities. And I think it struck me that that's the strategy that has worked in other cases historically when we have faced what appears to be a monopoly power, and how we have disrupted it. And I'm just wondering how you think those other enterprises and nonprofits that you mentioned might work with individuals, because at the end of the day, and you talked about your device, I think the idea now you're almost making the individual now the gatekeeper to all of these companies, and you're bringing that power back, but how do we bring that partnership together between those enterprises and those institutions and the individuals who need to make the choices at their own home?
I think I need your help.
That's why she's here.
Exactly. I have seen this work in a topic that does not involve individuals, and this is why I don't know the answer. About 10 years ago, our research group, we have a project called POMI, Programmable Open Mobile Internet. This was led by Nick McEwen. And the idea was that we saw how Cisco was monopolizing the the networking equipment industry, okay? And it is a really difficult industry to monopoly to disrupt, because you need to have all the communications equipment to be updated at the same time to open it up for other players. And, but they did it, okay? So the project is called it's now called software-defined networking, and it's pretty famous right now. And it started with a research topic. As a research project, we got NSF money to start, and then we brought in the companies. And what was interesting was that in order to disrupt Cisco, the kinds of companies that wanted to chip in are companies like Google, okay? Because they are their customers and they want this industry to be vibrant, to have competition. So Google, HP, NEC, Deutsche Telekom, here are just some examples. These companies got together and they put in their resources, the engineering resources, and so we can then fill the gap between research and practice. So they bring in their engineers and resources, that becomes real, and then it becomes an open standard, and now there are three consortia with open consortia with 150 companies working on this standard, and it completely opens up the space, lots of startups, lots of competition, and you know, and that means a lot of innovation and improvement in the equipment industry. But now the next question, but this is a little bit different. Yeah. There are not a single company that is as threatened or as, it is not necessary for them to put in as much energy as some of these companies do. And of course it involves individuals' privacy, and this is the reason why I was asking you for help to bring in, and that's where the nonprofit, maybe the government and so forth, could be able to help in this kind of problem. But I think we have seen how technology research could actually disrupt monopolies in the past.
Yeah, so how to engage individuals, that's a really tough question. I mean, it is not, but from a kind of social science perspective, it always is, right? So, okay, I have 4 ideas, which I'm going to go through very quickly. The first one is regulation, because regulation by definition applies and can protect the rights of customers and individual customers in ways that applies equally to everybody, right? I mean, at least to some kind of extent. And so GDPR, it's still a bit unclear how it's going to play out, especially in the US. Some companies have gone to great lengths to kind of try to be GDPR compliant. Others, from what I've heard, are just kind of waiting a bit to see what the case law is going to look like. So anyway, but you know, things are like of that nature, definitely, like these kind of blanket regulations can definitely have an effect on kind of protecting basic privacy rights for like all the individuals of a given country. Second, the media. I think the media plays an incredibly important role, and that's not only because I studied journalism, it's because it changes perceptions, and it raises awareness. And I think that a lot of our perceptions and awareness are, I mean, in dialogue to some extent with the media. And I think that the coverage of technology, again, has changed quite a bit over the past 3 years. The third aspect, I would say, is activism. And again, like, I think that here, especially I'm thinking about activist movements coming from underrepresented minorities have been extremely vocal and successful in kind of changing the existing paradigm, which was, I mean, you know, it's a caricature, but basically that poor people don't care about privacy. And to some extent that it was kind of the way in which it was like the choice of the necessary. When you don't have a choice, you just give out, you know, privacy to get kind of convenience, right? And I think that a lot of activist movements, I'm thinking, for example, of Black Lives Matter, but also Con Mi Gente, have been really challenging that idea and being like, listen, like, these are central questions. Our communities are being policed, discriminated against, and having their privacy invaded. And so we need to change that. And then I think that they're really kind of changing the agenda to a significant level. And then finally, the fourth thing, and here I'm pleading for my own thing, but we need more kind of qualitative studies of how people use technology. just because the kind of practices that are emerging, the ways in which people are using and also misusing in some cases, right? I'm not saying that it's always for good, like, you know, there's a lot of illegal activity going on, but getting a sense of how all of these technologies are changing our practices and of the kind of fine-grained details that take place there, I think is super important. And so, for example, I think that studying how work is being transformed because of AI and algorithmic systems is one way in which we can kind of get a bit of a grip on how all of us as workers kind of deal with these technologies and the kind of concerns that they raise.
No, that's great. I don't have anything to add to that.
I feel like, though, Rachael, the work that you're doing at Fast AI is, in some sense, is an institution trying to find the individuals to empower them to work on these problems.
Oh, that is true. So yeah, there's kind of all these, and this is going to overlap, I think, with Angela's answer, that there are all these prongs of, I definitely think education can be very valuable. Individual education is not going to solve everything on its own. I definitely think we need this policy and regulatory component as well. Although I even think that education can help mobilize that in terms of kind of helping teach people kind of why the policy component is necessary and to recognize that. So I think this kind of blend of education, trying to involve people from more diverse backgrounds, and I mean that racially, gender, age, also kind of domain and background, and location. One of, there have been issues with ImageNet, the data set that was talked about earlier. 2/3 of those images are from the West, and so other continents are completely underrepresented in that, and that has implications for kind of how this machine learning performs, and really getting a more representative group of people working on these issues is important.
I just want to bring up one more point, which is you mentioned the government and you talk about regulations. There's another role. What I've been hearing from my friends in Europe is that that's where the GDPR came from, and they felt like they don't want to have their data taken by the American companies, and there is a bit of an interest of them building their own cloud, building their own facilities, and I actually think that there is a chance that, for example, some of these open movements can actually be supported by the government, but maybe not the American government, but more by European governments and so forth. Because when I held this workshop, it is a very small workshop, and we have some representatives from Russia, Tatarstan, and other countries where they, as the assistants are a little bit special, but this is what's going on with, it's because of AI that we are able to do natural language. But there are many, many natural languages, okay? And I wouldn't be surprised that some of these ideas may actually happen first in the non-English speaking countries, because they have to convert all the information that they have into their native languages. And some of these largest companies are, the Googles and the Amazon may not be willing to spend the time working on the poorer countries and countries that don't, it's not, they won't be targeting them as early, and therefore there might be more interest in building up these capabilities for different countries and different languages faster than America.
I want to give our audience a chance to join the conversation. But while I do that, I just want to say, Monica, so please stand up and we will have microphones brought to you. I was struck by the answer that you gave that the Palmy project started with an NSF grant, which to me is like, well, that makes me glad, because that's a government institution with a gift to an individual that started a spark that led it. So that's maybe just we needed a stronger lobbying for more NSF funding, but
I would love that. We actually do have NSF funding already.
Hi, thank you for that talk, for that panel. I was wondering if your long-range thinking has turned to self-sovereign identity, the way the decentralized web is talking about. This is where, you control your own identity and you wait for decentralized versions of all the apps to show up, and then you give out, each individual person or company gives out exactly the attributes they want, and they share them. I mean, that's a long-range thinking, but I haven't heard it mentioned.
I didn't quite understand the full question. Because I couldn't hear very well what you said.
Decentralized web, right?
Sorry, yeah, decentralized web, self-sovereign identity, the things that Tim Berners-Lee is working on with Solid.
So the idea here is like the virtual assistant is an interface, which allows you to talk to everything out there. And our first goal, we are actually, 10 years ago, I was trying to decentralize Facebook. I no longer want to do that. What we need to do is to focus on what is coming, which is actually going to be worse. When you have a single assistant that even, control, they would be intermediating between you and all those centralized or decentralized services, all by a single entity. And this is what we are really much more worried about. And the minute, if we could build up this decentralized virtual assistants, then they will take over some of the functions, such as sharing photos between your friends, because you can just tell your assistant is like, take all the Thanksgiving pictures and just share it with my family and so forth. It will be much more convenient. Whoever owns the interface wins. And this is why we care so much about the virtual assistants. So you start from there, don't let things get worse, and then you can go back and decentralize some of these other things. It will automatically happen because, all companies come and go, okay? And the thing that we have to shoot for is the next big company that is going to own even more data. And they will take over. I bet you, whoever, right now it's Google and Amazon, whoever wins will take over the other company's business. Because if I am going through my virtual assistant, I don't need one for advertising and one for shopping. And this is the reason why the competition is so fierce.
Thank you so much for this panel. I was hearing a lot of love for Apple and that companies should be more like Apple. And I say this holding my own iPhone, taking notes. But to visit an earlier point that you made on the panel, Apple's a pretty prime example of privacy only being available to people with means. With iPhones costing $1,000, and then you take enough photos, you start paying for your storage. And that's not even to take into consideration their questionable manufacturing practices, their data centers in Asia. So I'm curious as to why they seem to get a pass as opposed to the companies who use advertising to make money.
I should say I personally have concerns probably about all the major tech companies. So it's not, I wouldn't say I give Apple a free pass. To me, advertising raises, I think, particularly urgent issues and pervasive issues that are showing up in lots of areas, but I don't at all think that those are kind of the only issues worth discussing.
I am happy to talk about virtual assistants, but if you think about that being the new browser, once we have the browser, we don't even care which operating system it is, right? Because browser is the new operating system. And if you believe that the virtual system will be the new operating system, what is important is to have all the skills, which is, we talk about Amazon has 100,000 skills. Suppose all the skills are now made publicly available to any virtual assistant, which is what we are working on, right? And why need Apple to help establish that there will, to bring it to the first set of users? But if you can create this open linguistic web, and the virtual assistant can easily run on Android, okay? It really doesn't matter which operating system it is. But I need a company such as Apple to bring in the first gazillion million users to establish that there is an audience for this open internet. And then you can just spread it across all the operating systems, PCs, Android, and so forth. So I kind of look at them as the leader in this rather than the only way that we can get privacy.
And just to like finish, and like definitely not so much love, like on my part, it's just like I do feel that if we're focusing on privacy, Apple is not the worst. which does not mean that Apple doesn't have its own issues, which are different. You know what I mean?
How about this? We should lobby Apple, right?
As the political scientist in the room, I will say I strongly agree that is the right way to take it. Thank you all for this wonderful conversation, and we can definitely keep it going during the break. Thank you all for your questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.